Good morning. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, the President of Cyprus, ministers, guests for this very exciting event here in the East Med. I think it's an exciting story, as we heard from the speakers this morning. It's very hard to compete with the vision and optimism of the East Med region, especially when it comes to energy markets. But what I would like to do in the few minutes that I have is to put it a little bit in a context, to look at the world today, to mention a couple of themes, and to think very, very deeply how these themes are going to impact the sector, our lives, the economist, and many other things around us. First of all, the energy sector is very cyclical. We all looked at the energy sector this past year, and we were amazed by its performance, obviously driven by energy prices. But we tend to forget that the energy sector is very cyclical. And it really depends on, as we heard from our Greek friend here, on long-term planning, vision, and liquid capital markets. And as we know, over the last couple of months, many of these companies distributed dividends to many of their shareholders, and the performance was very positive. But as time goes by, and these companies will have to invest in many of these projects that we just heard from the sector, it will impact the way these companies operate, can invest, and the returns of many of these companies. So obviously, we really depend on liquidity of markets and the ability of global markets to support many of these projects. We've seen lots of innovation in this area, from ETFs to other innovative products. But the first thing I want all of us to think about is how capital markets are going to look like over the next couple of months and year in order to support these kind of visionary and important projects, especially in light of recessionary pressures. The second point that I want to raise is the political context. So we are in a perfect storm, not in terms of energy markets alone, but also in terms of politics and elections. East Med alone, we're talking about elections in Israel just in a few days. We're talking about elections in Cyprus very soon, Turkey and some other parts of the region, which means that the companies that we're hosting here today, they're looking very carefully what these governments are actually doing, not only today, but what they're going to do post-elections. And the last thing we want is a world full of inconsistent policies, as we experienced in the East Med energy story just a decade ago, before we were full of optimism about the East Med as a regional energy story. So I think tracking these inconsistent policies is a very, very critical component of this story. I'll just give you one number and one part of this story from the big world, which applies to the East Med as well. One of the main institutions for solving disputes between energy companies and governments is ICSID in the World Bank in Washington, D.C. If you actually look at the cases managed by ICSID from Argentina on one side of the world all the way through Asia, almost 50% of the disputes between companies, private and public, and governments, it's actually in the oil, gas, renewables, and the electricity sectors, which means that what we're going to see over the next couple of months and years is a spike in disputes between energy companies and governments as a result of all types of changes in policies. For example, new taxes, lower taxes, and reforms in the energy sectors in different parts of the world, including in the East Med. And I would like to say that this is particularly important in light of recessionary pressures, because if we learn anything from previous cycles is that during those kind of cycles, governments tend to change their policies. I would like to say a few words about agreements. We had very exciting agreements over the last couple of weeks, from the Lebanon-Israel agreement to some other agreements that the ministers mentioned this morning. But I want to mention one element which we didn't mention this morning, which I think is critical. And this is the human element. This is the bottom-up part of agreements. It's very easy sometimes, we think, to sign agreements on the government level. It's much more difficult to bring people together, companies, projects, and to make sure that this government actually take this vision to the ground. And if I learn anything from the East Med and the Middle East stories, that bottom-up agreements tend to be a little bit more successful than others. Just look at the Abraham Accords, which is really based on people from the Gulf and Israel come together on a regular basis. And then two additional points, actually three, one on technology, another one on the human talent, and I'll finish with renewables. When we think about traditional energy markets, we heard so much on about oil and gas from our friends here on stage. We don't think too much about innovation. We don't think too much about technology. It's been perceived as an old school industry. But in fact, if you follow the traditional oil and gas sector today, especially in the East Med, it's full of innovation. Just take as a mini example what's going on with floating LNG. In the past, when you looked at traditional LNG technologies, you were concerned about the fact that it takes years to build facilities. It used to be the case that it takes years to build refinery in the States or LNG facility in the East Med region. Now people think about floating LNG and other technologies to be innovative and to try to bring solution. So I think technology is a big part of the story, and we will see more and more traditional energy, technology and innovation hubs in the region, and I call all of us to be part of the story. With respect to the human element, clearly we're all aware of shortage of employees in different sectors. We tend to think that the energy sector has enough employees to support many of these projects that we heard about this morning, but it's not always the case. So we didn't mention this morning the support of the government on labor and its leadership. And then finally, with respect to renewables, I hear quite often criticism when people say, why do we talk about renewables only world by 2030, 2040, 2050? Why do we have all these deadlines and all these visions while we know that in reality it's very hard to get there, especially in light of what we heard this morning about natural gas and the high demand for that? And I think the real story here is kind of a parallel dialogue. On one hand, we signal to the market that we want the next generation to do what it can to build the infrastructure for renewables, but at the same time, we really have to support the economy today. And I think that what we see now is that since we didn't achieve the renewable energy goals, we have additional sources and resources to support the natural gas projects that we just heard about. So thank you very much for this very important discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.